The 100 Years' War. Now then, last video we finished with talking about how Edward III was now the King of England and his mother, Isabella, had been the last surviving child of Philip the Badass slash Philip the Handsome slash Philip the Iron King of France. Now, Philip the Iron King had been a massive badass motherfucker in France and one of the most ruthless kings ever. Now, when he fucking died, his son, Louis the 10th, was the king. And Louis the 10th didn't last 5 fucking minutes. He was dead very, very quickly, possibly poisoned by some cunt, leaving a pregnant wife. The minute that the baby was born, it fucking died. So the throne of France went to Louis's brother, Philip V, also called Philip the Tall, or Philip the Long, or Philip the Lanky Cunt. He was quite a good king, but he didn't last 5 fucking minutes either. Apparently, he drank some shitty water out of a river and it fucking killed him. But maybe he was poisoned, we don't fucking know. And then after Philip the Lanky came his brother, Charles IV, who was called Charles the fucking idiot, or Charles the stupid, or Charles the bit of a dick. So this all happened during the reign of Edward II of England. So you could say it's 3-1 to Edward. Now, Edward, as you remember, is probably a homosexual and got into trouble for having favourites and not treating his wife very well and not treating his uncles and cousins very well and lavishing all his attention on these boyfriends, basically, which led to him being overthrown by his wife and fucking killed, and replaced by Edward III, his son. Now, Edward III was a boy, but when he grew up, he decided to kill this boyfriend of his mother, this guy called Mortimer, because he'd basically killed his father. And he wasn't going to kill his mother because Edward loved his mother still, even though she was pretty fucking ruthless and had been involved with the murder of Edward II. So anyway, Edward III was king of England, and Charles IV was king of France. And Edward II of England was dead, and Edward III was now an adult and was able to rule himself. Now, in France, they had this rule about women, that they didn't want women to be kings, and they had some kind of clause in their laws that said that women can't be fucking kings. It has to be a fucking man. Whereas in England, they didn't have any rule like that, and it was possible for a woman to be king. They had had Matilda before as queen, as a ruler, but that hadn't gone very well. But it was in practice possible for there to be a woman as the ruler of the country, as queen, like a king, as opposed to being a queen consort, that's the wife of a king. So anyway, Charles IV of France fucking died, and Isabella, his sister, said, well, I should be queen, really. And the French said, no, you can't, because women can't be queen, so you can fucking stay in England and be Edward II's queen in England, and you can't you can't come here and be our ruler because we're going to have your cousin Philip instead. And Philip was the nephew of old King Iron King. The old Iron King had a brother who was called Charles of Valois, and Charles of Valois had been a bit of a prick, and he'd also had a son called Philip, and he is known as Philip the Fortunate, or Philip the Lucky Bastard, or Philip the Jammy Cunt. And this Philip was named king after the death of all his cousins. And so you've got Philip VI of France, who's new king, and Edward of England, Edward III, says, well, hang on, you can't have a woman as queen, but what about the line of succession? Surely I, being the grandson of Philip the Iron King, am a much better candidate and a much better ruler for France than fucking Philip the Lucky Bastard, because I am actually a direct descendant of fucking Philip, and you aren't. You're just his fucking nephew, so I should be king, not you. Now, he knew that the French people were not going to accept him as king and were going to tell him to fuck off. And he was really using this argument of a claim to the Kingdom of France as a pretext for going to war with France. And the reason he wanted to go to war with France was to take back some of those French lands, those French lands which previously had been owned by the English and had been lost by old King John. You remember that Henry II had owned loads of lands in France through his marriages and through his father and grandfathers and so on. Whereas right now, what has happened is that the French had sort of kicked the English out of most of those lands, and the English had very little lands left in France. So Edward III thought, if I go to war with France, then I can fucking take some of this shit back and establish another English empire in France. So he declared himself King of France as well as England, and just said, right now I am King of France. And he changed the English coat of arms. Now the English coat of arms was 3 lions or leopards. They didn't know the difference between a fucking leopard and a lion, but we'll call them lions. 3 lions going on they're golden lions on a red background. And Edward decided to quarter the coat of arms, 4 quarters, and have the lions in 2 of the corners, and then to have the French coat of arms in the other 2. The French coat of arms was 3, was a bunch. It wasn't 3. It was a bunch of lilies on a blue background, golden lilies on a blue background. They call it the fleur de lis. So you had this new coat of arms, the fleur de lis and the lions quartered. And so Edward decided to go to war against France. And the war ended up dragging on for longer than 100 years. There were some breaks during the war, some little ceasefires and treaties and pieces, but basically the projected period of conflict between the 2 lasted over 100 years and spanned the lives of various kings on both sides. So anyway, now Edward III was quite the badass, and he was quite good at fighting in the battles and everything, and he was better than Philip VI of France. And Philip wasn't that great, but the English had developed and had started using a weapon called the longbow. And the longbow was, like a, bow and arrows, archery. And the longbow was a really good weapon because you could fire loads of arrows really quickly and at quite a good distance with some accuracy. And the English had started training all men to be good at archery and to be able to fire these fucking things. And also, they didn't require you to have loads of money. It's just a piece of wood with a string and some arrows. Now, knights in armor, the sort of traditional. Imagine the knight in a suit of armor on a horse with a lance and a shield, covered from head to foot in armor, metal. That was fucking expensive, and all the men that were in all this armor, they were rich people. They had to spend a lot of money to be able to be a knight in armor, and but you could train a peasant, some poor cunt from a farm to be good as an archer, and they could kill a knight just as well as another knight could, and they could do it at distance. And so the English developed a way of using a lot of these archers. The French were continuing to use a lot of mounted knights on horses, and that was their favorite kind of type of soldier to use. And they had the sort of philosophy that was a proper way to fight, was to have knights on horses, and that those were proper fighters, and that some peasant shooting you with a bow and arrow was not really good, and it was a bit cowardly way to fight, and they were just fucking peasants, and they weren't as good as a proper knight. The French also used crossbowmen, and crossbows were okay. They were very good in a siege because they were very accurate, and you could sort of hold them in position and wait before firing, whereas a bow and arrow, you've got to use your muscles to pull it back and fire it. But a crossbow took longer to load and didn't have as much range as the longbow. Now, the English had been fighting wars in Scotland and in Wales, and quite often lost a lot of battles. And they had learned that knights on horseback often have problems, and and the age of the mounted knight was ending, and the age of infantry was beginning. Infantry being soldiers fighting on foot, because all you had to do to kill cavalry was just to get loads of spears. Excuse me, using spears and spiky sharp objects, then the horses either run into them and die, or the horses won't run into them at all, so then the cavalry can't be used. And also using projectiles, archers and so on, to shoot the men off the horses, or shoot the horses so the men fall off, then you fucking kill them while they're on the ground. And the English had a lot of problems with trying to use mounted knights and cavalry against spears and archers and stuff. And also it was possible to use the terrain to dig trenches, to place spikes in the ground and things like that to make it hard for cavalry or mounted knights to be used. So the English had basically said, well, we're not going to fucking bother using knights and cavalry anymore. We're gonna get the knights to get off the horses and fight on foot, instead. And we're gonna get loads of fucking archers because they're cheap and they're good. And they also developed a method of getting these wooden stakes, these big sharp fucking bits of wood, and sticking them in the ground in front of their archers and men, so that the enemy horses would either run into them or not want to go near them, the horses. And so the English learned their lesson from their wars against the Welsh and the Scottish, and started using more infantry and using archers, and not using mounted knights so much. And this was a really good thing. They also made it a law that all men had to train every day at how to use the longbow in case they were needed to fight in a war. So this was really, really good. The English developed a really good way of fighting. Anyway, so the English had this war against the French, and they didn't win every single battle, but they did quite well. And one of the most famous battles was called Battle of Crécy, and the English used these archers to just shoot the French horses, and the French knights were getting fucked on. And it had been raining, and the ground was all muddy, so the French were getting stuck in the mud, and the English were shooting them with their longbows, and then finishing them off with their knights afterwards. And even if the French had more troops than the English still managed to fuck them over. And there was another battle called Poitiers, and the Battle of Poitiers, it wasn't Philip VI, it was his son John II, who was now the King of France at this time, and he was captured by the English and taken to England as a prisoner, and had to fucking stay there. And some of the Hundred Years' War was fought in Spain, because the Spanish had a dynastic conflict and a civil war, where there were two claimants to the kingdom of Spain, and one of the claimants was supported by the English and the other one by the French, so there was some fighting there. Similarly, in Brittany, which is a part of France, there was another war, or another theatre of the war, in which the English were fighting on one side against the French to see which cunt got to be the Lord of Brittany. So in this stage of the war, the English were quite good, and they were better than the French, and Edward III was a really great military commander. Edward III had a lot of children, loads of children, and this was to cause huge problems later on, massive problems later. Anyway, his oldest son was also called Edward, and they called him the Black Prince. And Edward the Black Prince was a real badass and really good at fighting and a really good commander. And he was the leader in the Battle of Poitiers when they captured the French king, John II. And Edward was really badass. And in the Battle of Crécy, the Black Prince killed, or his men killed, this guy called John of Luxembourg, who was king of Bohemia. And he was blind, this John of Luxembourg guy, and he went into battle against the English with his horse tied to the horses of his other knights. And he died in the battle. And Edward the Black Prince thought that he was a real badass, and he thought, oh, what a fucking way to die, what a hero. Even though he was my enemy, I've got a lot of fucking respect for the cunt. So he copied his coat of arms, his symbol, rather, not coat of arms, but his symbol, which was 3 white feathers, and his motto was Ich dien, which is German for I serve. And he said, this is going to be on the Prince of Wales shit from now on. We're going to have the 3 feathers, and we're going to have Ich dien on all my shit. So even today, it still is now that the Prince of Wales has Ich dien and the 3 feathers, and it's on English money, and it's on loads of things to do with the Prince of Wales. Anyway, so Edward the Black Prince was the oldest son of Edward III. By the way, Edward III was married to this woman called Philippa of Hainault. I don't know how to say that word. And she was the daughter of this duke, or this king, who had helped Isabella to take over England. Um, anyway, but Philippa and he had enormous family, and anyway, Edward the Third also had a second son, whose name was Lionel of Antwerp, and Lionel of Antwerp really didn't do very much, and he was extremely tall, and that's all anybody has to say about him. And Lionel died very young. Now, during this time, this was the 14th century, the Black Death, which was an enormous plague, much worse than coronavirus, that this enormous plague had spread across the world and was absolutely deadly. It was killing just loads. It was an enormous plague. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I mean, it was like half of everybody died of this fucking plague, and it was horrible. And that was going around at this time and killing everyone. So anyway, Lionel of Antwerp died. I think he was in his 20s or maybe his early 30s, but he was fucking young. The third son of Edward III was called John, and he was born in Ghent, which is in sort of the modern Netherlands. And they called him John of Gaunt. Gaunt in English means really skinny and really thin. And it was some confusion about the word Ghent, and they sort of misheard it as Gaunt, and they called him John of Gaunt. And he's very important, and he becomes very important later because he does live to be an adult, proper adult, and he's quite a strong guy and a tough cookie. The fourth son is called Edmund, and he is Edmund of York, Duke of York, and he's also very important later on. And the fifth son is called Thomas, Thomas of Langley, and he's also very important later on. So you've got Black Prince, you've got Lionel of Antwerp, you've got John of Gaunt, you've got Edmund of York, and then you've got Thomas of Langley. Woodstock, not Langley, Woodstock. Thomas of Woodstock. Anyway, Thomas. Anyway, so fucking 5 sons that, and then loads of daughters as well. But we don't really talk about the daughters because they're not really that important at the moment for talking about England. They marry other people, and they're important in other places, but they're not really that important for talking about the history of England. Anyway, right. So. We've had all these battles, Crécy and Poitiers, and battles in Spain and battles in Brittany, and the English have been quite good and quite successful. They haven't taken over all of France. The French still run France, most of it, but they've been quite successful winning battles. Anyway, Edward III's son, the Black Prince, the oldest son, the badass, dies 1 year before his father, Edward III. So Edward III decides that his grandson will be king after him. The grandson is the Black Prince's son, and his name is Richard. The Black Prince was married to this woman called Joan of Kent, and they call her Joan the Fair Maid of Kent, which means Joan the really, really good looking woman of Kent, or the fucking tasty, Joan the fucking tasty of Kent. And they had a son called Richard of Bordeaux, because that's where he was born. So anyway, Black Prince drops dead, and then Edward III dies, and the grandson Richard is the new king, and he's Richard II, because you remember the Lionheart was the first, so Richard II, and he's a child. And because he's a child, he can't run the country himself and be king. He has to have somebody or some people to run shit for him. And he has Richard has these three uncles who are left alive, because remember his father's dead, and Lionel of Antwerp is dead, and Richard has John of Gaunt, Edmund of York, and Thomas of Woodstock as his three uncles, and they kind of run things for him and run the country. And John of Gaunt is the boss man, and he is the fucking dude who basically runs shit and acts like the king while his nephew is a child. And these uncles don't like the fact that their nephew is the king. They think that one of them should be the king instead, rather than the child, and they're pissed off. But they do their best to try to fucking run the country, but they also try to get shit for themselves through this power. And John of Gaunt tries to make himself king of Spain, but he fails to do that. And he makes a lot of money for himself. It's all very corrupt. And anyway, Richard's a boy, and during this time, the French king John II has died, and they have a new king called Charles V. And Charles V of France is quite good at fighting, and he wins some battles against the English, and they sort of become on the ascendancy, and so it's a bit of a comeback by the French in the 100 Years' War. And all this is going on. There's fighting in France. There's the plague, and there's a child on the throne of England. Now, something very big happens in England at this time. Now we're coming towards the end of the 14th century now, and the king is now 14 years old, Richard II. And basically what happens is that there is an enormous sort of revolution, or attempt at revolution, and it's called the Peasants' Revolt. Now, during the plague, when everyone was dying, the economic situation changed a little bit. Now, all these peasants and poor people, loads of them died, and this meant that the ones that were still alive were able to become a little bit richer and to get a little bit more money and a little bit more stuff, and to sort of do a little bit better in life, because there were fewer of them competing for more. There wasn't so much competition between workers for labour, so they were able to get better wages and stuff, if you understand. But anyway, basically the peasants, the poor, were doing a little bit better than they had before, because so many people had died in the plague. And economically, I mean, of course, they weren't very happy, because they were still dying of plague and shit, and they were still poor, they were still peasants. But anyway, and John of Gaunt and the powerful leaders that were running England said, well, we want to get some more money, and we want to squeeze the poor and get them to fucking give us loads of money. Even if they are poor, we want all their money. So they introduced this new tax, which was called the poll tax, and this was a tax that everybody had to pay. And it wasn't like, if you're rich you pay this, if you're poor you pay that. It was, all the poor have got to pay all this fucking money to the state, and there's no question about it, and you can't say, oh, I haven't got the money. You've still got to pay it, and if you haven't got it, you've got to get it, and you've got to pay it, or you're going to get fucking put in prison or killed or whatever. And they sent these men around the country to collect this fucking money off everybody. And the rule was that it was everybody that was, I think, 12 or older had to pay this money. So it was supposed to be all adults. Now they considered adults as anyone above 12, because in those times there was no such thing as a teenager, and they didn't have a concept of adolescence. Basically, once a woman had her first period, she was an adult. Once a boy's voice started to break and he started to get erections and stuff, he was a man. Um, and there was no such thing as a sort of idea of a 13-year-old being a child, or a 14-year-old being a child, or something between them. Now today you'd say that that was paedophilia, and they were all a bunch of pedos. But back then, um, they had no concept of sort of going through puberty or being a teenager. It just didn't exist. You were a little child, or you were an adult. So if you were 13 or 12, you could be fighting in battles or whatever. Anyway, so they said everyone's got to pay this money, and they went around trying to collect it. And some people sort of lied and said, well, oh no, I've got one child, when they actually had three. Or they'd say, oh, there's only one person living in this house, when there were maybe five of them. So when they went around to collect the money, they didn't get as much as they thought they would. And John of Gaunt and his and his tax people said, oh, they're a bunch of cunts. They're all fucking lying and cheating to get out of paying this money. So they're going to send these inspectors to make sure they get the money, and make sure that they get proof from everybody of how much money they have and how many people there are, so that we get all the money off everybody. And they sent these cunts round to people, and if the people had a daughter, and they said, oh, my daughter's 10 years old, then these tax cunts said, well, we're going to have to prove that she's 10 years old by checking if she's had a period yet, or if she's if she's a child or an adult. And they were basically sexually assaulting and molesting everyone's children to see if they were what they called an adult or not, to see if they had to pay the tax, if you understand. Which of course, if you're a father or a mother, you don't want some cunt coming around and touching your children to try to get money off of you. It's absolutely horrific. So this really fucking pissed off the people. And these are people who have for thousands of years just sat there and took shit from the lords and the kings, and done everything they were told, gone to fight and get killed in battles whenever the cunt lord told them to, worked all fucking day and given half their shit to some cunt just because he was richer than them, and they'd sat there and taken it for thousands of years. And now this really fucking was the last straw, and this really made them think, fuck the king and fuck whoever's trying to tell us what to do, and fuck this tax. And this rebellion started among ordinary people all around the country, and they started fucking killing the tax collectors. They said, fuck you, you're not touching my children, and I'm not giving you the tax. And they fucking cut his head off and said, fuck these cunts. So these people started going around the country, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them, and they got like this huge army together, and they went down to the tax place, they killed the tax man, and they went round to the bishop and the lords, and they fucking killed them and took all their shit. And it got really big. It was this enormous revolt of these people. And the king is a child, well, he's 14, so he's an adult by their fucking definitions, but he's not old enough to have full responsibility of being king. Anyway, John of Gaunt has fucked off somewhere, and he's not around, which is lucky for him, because if they got their hands on him, they'd fucking cut his head off. But they managed to get their hands on the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they get his head cut off, and some other people. And basically, Richard, the 14-year-old king, has to sort it out himself. And he meets with these cunts, and they say, "Oh, we still love you, Richard. We still love the king. We love you, but we want you as king, and sort of like something like communism or something like that for everybody else. And we don't want what these lords telling us what to do, and we don't want all these fucking taxes, and we don't want all this inequality. We want to live in a sort of free, equal society where we all have rights, and all these cunts at the top, get rid of them, apart from you." And the king says, Richard says, "Yeah, okay, I'm agreeing to that. Don't worry, I'm your man. I'm going to sort it all out so that you get everything you want. So just go home and I'll sort it out." And the peasants, the people, sort of believe him, and they all go home. And then once they've put their weapons down, and then Richard gets his armies together and everything, and they go around and they say, "Right, fuck you all. Who the fuck do you think you are, trying to tell me what to do?" And says, "Right, you're now going to be fucked over. If you ever everyone who was trying to rebel, they're all going to be hang them all, kill them all." They said, "Oh, you said you'd help us. You can't." He said, "I lied because you're all a bunch of fucking traitors." And he had them all fucking killed, and said, all these fucking people are going to be even more peasants. You're going to be shat on even more from an even greater height from now on. And the rulers and the ruling classes are going to shit on you even more than they would before, because you've been such cunts. And so the peasants' revolt was crushed by a 14-year-old boy who just lied to them. But anyway, so the whole system survived, the system of the monarchy and the aristocracy and everything. So anyway, Richard II, he grew up eventually, and he got old enough to be king in his own right. And his uncles weren't happy because they wanted to continue running the country, and they thought they could continue pushing him around and telling him what to do as an adult. But he said, "Fuck them." And he really resented them for telling him what to do and pushing him around, and his uncle John of Gaunt especially. And he had these favourites, a bit like Edward II had. Richard had the same sort of situation. We don't think he was gay, but he did have these favourites, and one of them was the Duke of Oxford. Excuse me. And this sort of conflict started where these uncles and cousins were annoyed by the king favouring these favourites instead of them. And these bunch of lords got together, and they called themselves the they called themselves the what the fuck did they call it? I can't remember what they fucking called themselves. I'll have to write it down. Anyway, they got together, and they sort of challenged the king, and they said, "Right, we want you to sort this out, and I want you to stop giving shit to your favourites and start giving it to us instead, because we're blood and they're not." And he said, "Well, fucking hell, I don't want to be doing that because I don't like you. You're just a bunch of cunts, and I've got these people I like." So they started rebelling against him, basically, and sort of forcing him to let them kill people that they didn't like. They were his friends. And then he managed to get his power together himself, and then get revenge on these cousins and people by fucking killing them. And he killed his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, or his uncle Thomas. He killed his uncle Thomas, and Richard basically created his own private army of people who were just loyal to him, and he used them as like a big gang to go around and fuck people over that didn't like Richard. And so Richard had all these problems with these other with these other lords and noble houses and family members and these uncles and cousins. And one of his cousins was this son of John of Gaunt, and his name was Henry, and this Henry was called Henry Bolingbroke. Now, John of Gaunt had married this woman called Blanche of Lancaster, who was the Duchess of Lancaster, which was a very powerful title, which has a lot of money and power with it. So John of Gaunt was the Duke of Lancaster, and his son Henry Bolingbroke got into some trouble because he was involved in this opposition to Richard, and Richard had exiled him, told him to fuck off to France and not come back, and so he had to fuck off to France, this Bolingbroke. And while he was in France, John of Gaunt, his father, fucking died. And by the way, during this time, not much is going on with the French. I mean, the French have sort of won a bit, and the English are sort of concentrating on everything that's going on with Richard II and his uncles and stuff. So that's why I'm not really talking much about France at the moment. The French, the 100 Years' War really has two big stages: the sort of Edwardian stage, which was Edward III, and then the Lancastrian stage, which comes later, which we'll come to in a bit. But coming back to Richard, now Bolingbroke. So Bolingbroke's in France, and he hears that his father is dead. So he thinks, well, I'm going to come back to England and be Duke of Lancaster and have all my father's castles and lands and money and shit. But Richard II says, right, well, I've exiled Bolingbroke, so that means that he's a criminal and a cunt, and that he's not entitled to inherit his father's shit. So I'm going to take all of John of Gaunt's shit for myself. So he does that, and Bolingbroke's really pissed off. So anyway, and Richard's made quite a lot of enemies by pissing off loads of people, and there aren't that many people who like him. And anyway, some shit happens in Ireland, because at this time the English have sort of fucking invaded and taken over parts of Ireland and trying to rule the Irish. Anyway, so Richard has to go to Ireland to sort some shit out over in Ireland, and while he's away, Bolingbroke invades England and he tries to take over his father's stuff, and he gets together with some friends, and one of his biggest friends is this fellow called Henry Percy, and Percy is the Earl of Northumberland, which is in the north of England, and it's a really big, powerful part of England. And these Percy people are really hard cunts because they live on the border with Scotland, so they have to deal with the Scottish, fighting the Scottish quite a lot, and they're quite a hard bunch of bastards, these Percy family. And the Percys join up with Henry Bolingbroke. Lancaster, by the way, is in the north of England as well, but it's not as far north as Northumberland, but it's in the north. So the north of England is where they start their campaign. So Bolingbroke joins up with Percy. Now because Richard's fucked off to Ireland, his uncle Edmund, Duke of York, is now sort of left in charge of things in England. And Edmund of York goes and sort of says he's supposed to try to stop Bolingbroke, but because they're kind of sympathetic towards each other, because Edmund is Bolingbroke's uncle, and he sort of sympathizes with them, and he's basically one of them, so he doesn't actually stop Bolingbroke from doing what he's doing. And Bolingbroke isn't satisfied with only taking Lancaster back and stuff. Bolingbroke decides that he's going to take over the throne and become king, and fuck over Richard altogether. And Richard's so unpopular that he doesn't really have a lot of support. So Richard comes back to England, and he's basically outnumbered by Bolingbroke and Bolingbroke's friends. And Bolingbroke says, right, I'm gonna fucking take over the throne. You better fucking give up. Now, how does it work with a king giving up? Now, a king can abdicate, which means quit being king. But what happens when a king abdicates is that the throne should then go to the person who is the heir, the next in line to the throne. And that wasn't Bolingbroke, actually, because Bolingbroke was the son of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was the third son of Edward III. You remember that there was the Black Prince, that's Richard's father, and then there was Lionel of Antwerp, the tall guy that didn't last 5 seconds. Now, Lionel of Antwerp had married a woman called Philippa of Ulster, and they had had a woman called Elizabeth de Burgh, and they had had a daughter called Philippa of Ulster, who had then had several children and a grandson who was called Edmund Mortimer. And he's actually related to the old Mortimer guy that was shagging Queen Isabella. Anyway, so the Mortimer guy is actually the heir to the throne, really, by the rights of succession. And also the King Richard had actually named Mortimer as his heir. But Mortimer was a child, and the only people that were sort of with him were women and people that really were no match for Bolingbroke, and none of them said anything against Bolingbroke, and none of them complained, and not one person said to Bolingbroke, "You're not the right person to take over." They just kept their mouths fucking shut. And Bolingbroke took over the throne. He said, "Richard, you've got to quit." Richard abdicated. And then they put Richard in prison and they fucking murdered him. And Bolingbroke was Henry IV. And he was the first Lancastrian king, because he was the Duke of Lancaster. And he also made some bullshit claim about how he said that old Edward I was never the real king, and he said that Edward I's younger brother, who was called the Crouchback, was really older than him, and that he had just been denied the throne because he was a Crouchback, which meant he had sort of a bad back. And this Crouchback was actually the ancestor of John of Gaunt's wife, Bolingbroke's mother. So he said, because I'm descended from Crouchback, and then I'm the rightful king. And this was bullshit. This was absolute bollocks. There was absolutely no truth whatsoever in this claim. He was basically saying that Edward I was not the right person to be king. Neither was Edward II, and neither was Edward III. And that it should have been Crouchback and some other cunt, and then some other cunt, and then him. But anyway, nobody argued with Bolingbroke about him being king at the beginning, and they were quite happy with Richard being murdered and having Bolingbroke as king. So Bolingbroke was a king of England now, and he started throwing his weight around and being a bit of a cunt. And remember the Percys were these people that helped him become king. And Bolingbroke had several sons and some daughters as well, but of course we don't talk about the daughters so much because of the unfair sexist system. But Bolingbroke's oldest son was Henry, again, Henry of Monmouth. And Bolingbroke had three sons who grew up to be, well, four sons who grew up to be quite important men. And Henry of
of Monmouth was the oldest of those sons. Anyway, Henry Bolingbroke is now Henry IV, and he's king. And the Percy family, the Earl of Northumberland, who was Henry Percy, has a son, also called Henry Percy, but his nickname is Hotspur. So Hotspur is this son of Northumberland, and he marries this woman called Elizabeth Mortimer, who is aunt to the guy who was supposed to be the heir to Richard, this Mortimer boy, and has a brother also called Mortimer, and this Mortimer is someone who Henry is scared of because he thinks he could possibly claim the throne through his ancestry from Lionel of Antwerp. So he doesn't like him. And what happens is there's another rebellion against the English in Wales, and this fellow called Owain Glendower is this Welsh leader who fights against the English quite successfully. He's like another William Wallace character, but he's Welsh. And this Mortimer is leading an army to go and fight against him, and is captured and taken prisoner by Glendower. And so this Mortimer guy is the brother-in-law of Percy, young Percy Hotspur. So young Percy Hotspur says to the king, I want to go and rescue my brother-in-law, or I want you to pay to get him back because he's my brother-in-law. And Henry says, well, fuck him, I don't give a shit. In fact, I think he's probably a traitor, and he's probably working with Glendower. And to be fair, Mortimer does marry Glendower's daughter, but anyway, basically what happens is Henry IV gets into a big argument with Hotspur, and Hotspur is like a real badass. He's a proper fighter and stuff. And Hotspur and his father decide to rebel against Henry, and they say, look, we fucking put you on the throne. We fucking helped you when you fucking needed help, and now you're in power. You're shitting on us and telling us to fuck off and treating us like shit just because now you're in power. When you needed us, you were, oh, we love you, but now you're being a cunt. So the Percys rebelled against Henry, and they wanted to put one of these Mortimer people on the throne. And Henry went into battle against them, and there were two battles. The first one, they killed Hotspur, and then the second battle, they killed Hotspur's father, Earl of Northumberland. So the Percys were crushed, and that was quite important. The Percys continue to be very important in the history. The Percy family are very important, but and Henry basically takes loads of their lands away from them and disinherits them, and says the Percys they don't exist anymore. The Percys can go fuck themselves, and I'm keeping all their shit. And Percys are a bunch of cunts. I don't like the Percys anymore. They're fucked, and I'm taking all their lands and all their castles and all their fucking shit, and they can just fucking live like peasants. So the Percys have been fucked over, and Bolingbroke is King Henry IV, and he's already had two rebellions against him in England and one from Wales. And he says to his son Henry that when he takes over, he says, when I die, you better fucking make sure you get some proper unity in the country. And the best way to do that is to go and fucking fight France. He says, if you go and fight France, then you'll get all the people together behind you fighting for their country and supporting you against the French. And that way they won't be gagging up, fighting you and trying to bring you down. So when I'm dead, you better fucking go and fight the French. So Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, dies, and his son becomes Henry V. And Henry V is a young man, and he does what his father advised, and he finds some excuse to go to war against the French. Now, the King of France now is this cunt called Charles VI. And Charles VI is a really shit king. He has mental problems and he actually goes insane. And when I say insane, I don't just mean he's got mental health problems. What happened one day was he was riding his horses and he was with all his men and they were traveling. And he just got his sword out and started killing everybody. He actually went around and started randomly killing everybody that was near him, actually with a sword, actually killing them all randomly in a fit of madness. He also believed that he was made of glass. The guy was just, and he was no good as king whatsoever. He couldn't do anything. There were periods in which he was all right and could do stuff, but most of the time he was useless. So Henry V thought this was the good time to fuck over the French. They've got a shit king, and this is the time to go and fuck him over, and this will stop my people from rebelling. Henry also decided to become friends with the Percys again, and he said, I forgive you for fucking up and trying to overthrow my father, but you know, he's dead now. This is you and me, Percys. Let's be friends. And the new Earl of Northumberland is made is restored to his position and is forgiven and becomes friends with Henry V. But they don't get all their lands back. They get most of them, but some of them Henry keeps or gives to other people. Some of them. So they're not as powerful as they used to be, and the Percys are a little bit annoyed that they haven't got everything that they used to have. And they feel a little bit hard done by about the whole thing. Anyway, and nobody really wants to fuck with Henry V because he's quite a badass as well. So anyway, Henry V decides to invade France, and he says, "I'm supposed to be king of France. You know, Edward III was right, so I'm going to continue that tradition of saying I'm king of France." And you remember all the tactics Edward III had about using archers and fighting in the mud and shooting the horses and all this sort of stuff. Well, Henry's continues all these tactics that Edward III had. Anyway, so now in France, because the King of France is so shit, there are two factions in France that are sort of fighting over who gets to control him, and there are two people who are arguing and trying to be in control. One of them is this fellow called Orleans, and Orleans is a relative of the King of France, and he thinks he should be in control. And there's also this fellow who is the Duke of Burgundy, and Burgundy wants to be in control. And the two of them are rivals. And basically Burgundy's people assassinate Orleans, and so Burgundy can be in control. Now, this Orleans guy was accused of shagging the king's wife, and Burgundy's people said that the Dauphin, that's the prince in France, was not actually and his brothers were not actually the children of the king, but were the children of this Orleans guy. And this also was really great for the English because everything was fucked up in France and they were fighting against each other, and it was a really good time for a war against them when they're all divided. So anyway, Henry starts his campaign, and the plan is that they're going to go to France and just start taking shit and causing a problem. And if they get into battle with the French, then they'll fuck the French over by using the same sort of tactics that they used against the French before, when it was Edward as king. So Henry and his armies, they're getting ready to go over to France, and there is a plot to kill Henry by a few English nobles, and it's called the Southampton Plot. Now, we have to go back a little bit to some of the relatives of Henry. Now, remember that Henry's grandfather was John of Gaunt, who was the third son of Edward III, and that the fourth son of Edward III was Edmund, Duke of York. And this Edmund, Duke of York, had two sons. One of them was called Edward of Norwich, and he was going to be the next Duke of York after the father died. And Edward of Norwich was the Duke of York now, who was with Henry V, and he was a really badass dude and a good fighter and really loyal and supported Henry. But Edward, Duke of York, had a younger brother, and his name was Richard of Konigsberg, and he was the Earl of Cambridge. And he didn't have as much money as his brother, and he married somebody from this Mortimer family. And remember, this Mortimer family are the people who were descended from the second line of Edward III, and the people who kind of could have or should have been the kings after Richard II. And when Henry's dad took over, they really weren't powerful enough to claim anything, but they're still around, and they're still kind of in the background as a possible threat, but nobody's really strong enough to really press their claim, and they themselves aren't really interested in making a claim. And anyway, so this Richard of Konigsberg, the Duke of York's brother, has married the sister of the guy that would be the Mortimer claimant. And basically, Richard of Konigsberg gets together with a couple of friends, and they want to kill Henry and make this Mortimer the king. But Mortimer doesn't want it, and he's not interested, and he doesn't want to be king, and he's loyal to Henry. And he basically spills the beans and grasses up the conspirators, and he goes to Henry and says, fucking Konigsberg is trying to kill you, and these cunts want you dead. Now they want to make me king, but I'm not interested, and I'm coming to you in all honesty. I'm telling you that I'm not involved, and I'm telling you that these cunts are traitors. So this Konigsberg and friends are killed. Henry executes them for being traitors. Fair enough, they were trying to kill him, so they were traitors, so they were killed. And then Henry goes to fight the French, and he goes to this place called Harfleur, which is a town on the coast of France, and he takes over Harfleur off the French, and then he goes around the French countryside burning and pillaging. And then the French meet him in the big battle at a place called Agincourt. And the Battle of Agincourt, the English are outnumbered by the French, and the French have a lot of these mounted men on horses, these knights on horseback, and the English have a lot of these archers, longbows and stuff. And basically it's been raining very hard, and the English are sitting there waiting for the French to come. The ground is very muddy. The English have wooden stakes sharpened sticks of wood in the ground. They have archers, longbowmen, and they have all their knights or men with armor. They have them dismounted on foot, ready, waiting to fight the French when they get there. And the French basically just attack. They say, fuck the English, we're just going to attack. And they attack, and they all get fucking killed. The English shit all over them. They fucking annihilate the French. The French get completely fucked over and destroyed in this battle. And it's a really great victory for the English. It's an enormous win. So Henry has won this fucking battle, and he's absolutely over the moon. The French leader at the moment is the Dauphin, the prince, because Charles, the King of France, is useless. Another thing happens in France at this time, which is that this Orleans guy had been assassinated by the Burgundy guy, and this Orleans guy had been very close friends with the Dauphin, and some people say that he was actually the Dauphin's real father. And the Dauphin now was called Charles, and he wanted revenge for the death of Orleans, so he assassinated Burgundy, and so he's killed Burgundy. And his father, Charles VI, is at this time not crazy. He's having a spell of sanity, and Charles says, that's not right, you can't go around killing people, son. So he says, right, I'm disinheriting you. You're no longer my son as far as I'm concerned. You can fuck off, and you're not getting the throne. I'm disbarring you. I'm disinheriting you from the throne. And your sister is going to be the person who's going to take over. And if she gets married to someone, then that cunt is going to be the king when I'm dead. The cunt who marries your sister, not you, because you've pissed me off by murdering Burgundy. So the Dauphin has been disinherited. Now, Henry continues to defeat the French in battle time and time again, and he takes over loads of different lands in France. And he's basically recreating this empire that Henry II had back in the day. And he's really fucking over the French and taking over large parts of France. And he ends up making a deal with the King of France. And the deal is that they'll stop fighting. Henry can keep everything that he's already taken, but leave the rest to Charles to keep. But also that Henry will marry Charles's daughter, Catherine, and will become Charles's heir to the throne of France, because remember, the Dauphin has been disinherited. So Henry's pretty fucking happy, because now he's King of England and he owns most of France, and he's going to be King of France, all of it, as soon as mad old stupid King Charles VI dies. And Henry is still a young man. And he marries Catherine, and they have a son who's also called Henry, the prince. But what happens next is that Henry, unfortunately, dies. He's very, very young, and he dies. And then, quite shortly after he dies, the King of France dies as well. So this inheritance of England and France goes to Henry's son, who is a baby, who's only 6 months old, and he can't do anything apart from cry and shit his pants, and he's the king. So basically, what happens is that the Dauphin says, well, fuck the English, I'm gonna be king of France now. Who gives a fuck what my father said? We don't want the English as king of France. Henry V is dead. What's a baby going to do to stop us? And Henry V has named his brothers, two of his brothers, to take over as sort of looking after his son if he dies, and one of them to sort of look after England, the other one to look after France. But we're gonna stop now, and the next video we're gonna look at the final part of the 100 Years' War, leading into the Wars of the Roses.